looking forward to today's webinar around how to quickly achieve measurable and sustainable results from your ServiceNow Vulnerability Response Program. In just a few minutes, you'll hear from two talented individuals in our organization. First up, we have Yvette Matthews. Yvette is our Vice President of Services with over 20 years of experience in IT. I'm sure a handful of you know her name, as she's a highly sought-after expert in this industry. She's a certified trainer and has spoken at many events, specifically around asset management. When she's not working, she enjoys spending time painting or making progress on her detection fiction novel. And finally, we have Chief Technology Officer Josh Burnson, with over 20 years of experience as well in IT. Josh is an automation and workflow expert and has been proudly leading our organization to success. Josh has spoken at more than a dozen conventions and events, presenting on topics as broad as organizational risk management and as deep as workflow error prediction logic. In his free time, he too enjoys writing and is a published author. Yvette and Josh, thanks for being here. I'll pass it to you both.
Thank you for having us. Looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Rachel. Hello, we are ITS. We are a strategic consultancy with 4 decades of IT experience and are nationally recognized in the ITX and security operations space. Most importantly, we're a proud ServiceNow Elite partner. So, today's webinar is titled How to Quickly Achieve Measurable and Sustainable Results from Your ServiceNow VR Program. And if you find today's discussion valuable, please tell a friend. We'll be sending out this recording from the session, so if you have to head out early, you can always watch the recording later. Our agenda is as follows, and let's be clear about what we're discussing. Josh, can you please explain what Prescriptive Vulnerability Response, or otherwise known as PVR, is?
Sure. So Prescriptive Vulnerability Response, or as we like to call it PVR, is a pre-scoped vulnerability response package to help organizations quickly mature their vulnerability management practice. It's built around a predefined scope, a predefined price, and a predefined roadmap. It's a turnkey vulnerability response program.
What do you mean by turnkey?
Sure. So for any project, it's important to define objectives to build to outcomes, the critical components of success. With PVR, we've captured those outcomes from previous projects. We've given you the success in advance.
All right, Josh. So just to clarify, what do you mean by outcomes?
Sure. So with a traditional vulnerability response implementation, we spend a lot of time during scoping and during the workshop and assessment to determine the objectives first, which are those success criteria statements. And then we build out the outcomes, the building blocks for the project. We spend a lot of time during that initial phase of a project figuring out which outcomes fit the project and which outcomes don't, what the outcomes we need to throw out. What we've done in PVR is we've captured all of those outcomes, those individual building blocks, those goals for the project that we know need to be there for a successful project. And we've already thrown out all of those outcomes that are unnecessary for a first phase project. And that's what PVR is. It's all of those outcomes we know need to be there in phase 1 to be successful. Effectively, we've taken the guesswork out of a vulnerability response project. What I'd really like to do is I'd like to show you those outcomes. We have captured those here in this webinar. I'd like to go through those in detail so you can see what those outcomes are and see if they fit your objectives. Now, we've grouped those outcomes. We've created 3 groups. Now, the logical grouping helps make sense of those outcomes. There's actually a structure to those. This is the way we implement those outcomes, but it's also the way they get used in the real world. So let's first talk about this first category of outcomes, the data flow and validation. This is where we're pulling data into ServiceNow, into our system of action from our vulnerability scanners and from other data sources. It's not just about getting data into ServiceNow, though, it's about validating the data. It's very important that we make sure the data coming into ServiceNow is accurate and compatible with the system. So we spend a lot of time making sure that it's coming in properly, that it's accurate, that it's normalized, and if we have bidirectional integrations, that we're getting data going both directions. Once we have the data in the system, we focus on the core application. And this isn't just about configuring ServiceNow. This is about 3 main rules that get us to our efficiency and effectiveness in PVR. We're talking about prioritization, we're talking about assignment and grouping. In other words, knowing what work to do first, who does it, and then in what units we do that work. There's a few other tweaks that we make to the system to make it a little bit more user-friendly, but primarily it's around those 3 rules to really get the value out of vulnerability response. And then finally, in our third set of outcomes, we're focused on the end state. So once we have completed the work on a vulnerability, once we have remediated that vulnerability, how do we go validate that the work we've done is actually remove the risk? Or in those cases where remediation isn't the proper mitigation strategy, where we have to accept that risk or defer it to a later point, what is the process we have for accepting that risk? And of course, we need to know the big picture in our environment. What reports and dashboards do we have to look at to show us that big picture? So that's the last process flow in reporting. So let's dive into these in more detail. So our first set, our data flow and validation, starts right off the bat with vulnerability findings. And we're talking about bringing in data from a single vulnerability scanner. So PVR focuses heavily on a single process flow end to end, which means pulling data from one vulnerability scanner. We support the big 3, so Qualys, Tenable, and Rapid7, both the local and cloud versions, and picking the one that matters most in your organization, which we found for most organizations covers 80% or more of your vulnerabilities. But that's not the only data source we use in PVR. We also have several supporting data sources, starting off with the security assets coming from your scanner and normalizing those against your CMDB, making sure that we can account for all the assets that have vulnerabilities. We're also looking at data from the National Vulnerability Database so that we have those CVEs and CWEs that we can use for risk scoring. Now, the vulnerability scanners and the supporting data is really good for getting vulnerability data, what is vulnerable. It's not particularly good for telling us how to remediate those. We don't get very good solution data from those scanners. So for customers who have ServiceNow Vulnerability Response Pro and Enterprise, we have access to the Remediation Center, a way to get solutions right from ServiceNow, right from Microsoft and from Red Hat. We can pull that data in directly. We can apply it directly to our vulnerability findings and provide it right to our remediation team. Finally, in data flow and validation, we have a lot of data we can get from recorded future for enrichment, all the way from the risk score to the patch prioritization. This provides us with timely, accurate data that we can use for our risk scoring process to provide us with much more rich information and make better decisions on what to do first. So how has this impacted customers? Well, providing that solution data in particular has made a really big impact on customers being able to remove overdue vulnerabilities. So both the security team, the vulnerability team, and the remediation team suffers from this need to be able to find solutions. Both teams put a significant amount of effort into this, and by being able to provide that solution and information directly in the system with few clicks saves significant amount of time for both of these teams. Let's take a look at the next set of outcomes. The application configuration, the center of our outcomes, focuses on those 3 core rules: prioritization, assignment, and grouping. We'll start right off the bat with prioritization, what we call risk scoring. Risk scoring follows a weighted set of rules. In other words, we're pulling in several factors and deciding which one's most important. We start right off the bat with our vulnerability scanner. So we look at the data from our vulnerability scanner, and then we add on top of that enrichment from recorded future. So looking at that timely information to see how it should adjust the vulnerability scanner score. We look at additional information. For example, do we have patches? Is that vulnerability currently a threat? Also, the information about the device itself. Is it a more critical device or a less critical device in the environment? All of those factors go in to say what the proper risk score is. We include that risk score model in PVR. Immediately following that risk score is the time. We set a remediation target rule, which basically says this is when you need to work this vulnerability. So we know which ones to work and when they need to be worked by. As soon as we have that prioritization in place, it's time to do assignment. And that is who needs to do the work. We have 2 standard assignment rules. The first assignment rule is what we call a class-based assignment. The class-based assignment works very well for customers that haven't had the opportunity to mature their CMDB. It basically says we assign work based on what type of asset is in the system. And we found it to be a very effective model for most customers. For those organizations that have had an opportunity to put a lot of work into their CMDB and apply a lot of attributes to their CIs, we have CI-based assignment. We can pull those attributes, specifically the assignment attributes you've already built into your CMDB, and assign them directly to the vulnerability findings. Finally, we have grouping. It's very important we have a single standard grouping model. It makes it so that everybody can understand vulnerability response and that we can work the vulnerabilities in very small groups based on who is assigned to them and how we can solve them. This is the most effective way to resolve vulnerabilities quickly, and it aligns with most organizations' change management processes. Combining all four of these, we have found that automation has a very big impact on remediating vulnerabilities, but one of the big things that's often overlooked is consistency, especially consistency around grouping. When we can have a consistent grouping process, we can have a significant impact on the process time. And we've had a lot of customers tell us that adding that automation and consistency has reduced the process time for vulnerability response by as much as 50%. So let's take a look at the last set of outcomes, then we'll jump into a demo. So the last set of outcomes focus around the end state of our vulnerabilities. Once we've taken all those actions on our vulnerabilities, we need to go validate that we've removed the risk. On the vulnerability resolution side, we can support automated resolution. In other words, going back to our scanner and having our scanner tell us that the risk is removed, but we can also support manual resolution. And we have some cases where vulnerabilities, we just need to go in and say, yes, we've resolved them properly. We do have some occasions when we cannot remediate a vulnerability, where we have to accept the risk in the environment or defer it to a later time. We support deferred approval, both in a single approval model and a multiple groups of approvers, so 2 groups of approvers, both in parallel and serial. And of course, we need to know what the larger environment looks like. And we have 2 dashboards in PVR. The first dashboard is focused very specifically on our remediators, telling them exactly what work they need to do right now and in the future. And then the second dashboard is a much bigger dashboard, which shows us the overall trending of vulnerabilities for the entire organization. A very popular dashboard for all of security, or sometimes for the whole organization to look at. We'll see both of those dashboards in the demo coming up. Now, speaking about dashboards, some organizations see dashboards as kind of the icing on the cake. But the reality is, for many organizations, a single dashboard for everybody to focus on can have just as much impact as prioritizing all the vulnerabilities. In some cases, reducing overall vulnerabilities by as much as 40%. So let's take a look at this in a demo. So I want to start off by looking at a vulnerability in our source system first. So we are in Qualys, but if you're in Tenable or in Rapid7, you're going to see the same basic information. We're going to take a look at a couple of pieces of information here, and then we're going to spend the rest of our time in our demo in ServiceNow. So the first thing I want to focus on is that we're taking a look at a Microsoft vulnerability. This is actually a group of vulnerabilities. This is a very common situation. I can see that there's multiple vulnerabilities all kind of grouped up here together. The severity is a 5, and in Qualys world, that means that this is the highest severity, the most critical. So we have that information here. We also have the CVSS score. It's ranging anywhere from a 9.3, the highest score, all the way down to a 7.3, depending on which of these scores we're using in our risk scoring. And we'll see this reflected in ServiceNow when we switch over there. Finally, 2 other pieces of information that will be useful is this is exploitable. There is an active exploit against this vulnerability, and there's a patch. That's a good sign. That means there's something we can do about this. So let's switch over to ServiceNow and see what we see there. So first of all, I want to take a look at all the vulnerabilities, or at least a set of those vulnerabilities, so that we can see what the experience there is. So we can see that we're looking at a series of Qualys vulnerabilities. We can see the severity scores here. Now, though you may have noticed one thing different. These are a series of critical vulnerabilities, very much like the critical vulnerability we just looked at in Qualys, but the score number is different. ServiceNow does what's called normalization on those vulnerabilities. There's the possibility that we could pull in vulnerabilities from multiple systems at exactly the same time, all 3 of the ones that I mentioned. And all of them use a different scoring methods for severity. So it's very important that they all get sent to the same scoring system so that we can compare them to each other. In this case, we've simply reversed the numbers, so a 1 is a critical. We can also see how many devices or security assets are vulnerable. Some of these are just 1. We have some that are 3. That's simply because I have a fairly small demo environment here. And you can also see how many have already been remediated. And finally, we have a risk score, which is that accumulation of those CVSS scores and some other values using a risk score rule, one of the outcomes of prescriptive vulnerability response. So let's take a look at that specific vulnerability. Here we can see that severity, We can see that risk score and that it has an exploit, something that we saw on the Qualis side. But here's the value we didn't see there. We can see another piece of data. We can see that enrichment coming from recorded future. Now, the recorded future number is different than the risk score and the severity coming in from Qualis. Why is that? Well, we know that this particular vulnerability has an exploit. What recorded future is telling us is more timely information. Not only that there is an exploit, but that this is being actively exploited, which is a very different thing. We can go and take a look at our exploits, but we can see from recorded future that very recently, within the last day, that we have had an exploit in the wild. And we need to take that into account when we're making decisions on how we prioritize this particular vulnerability. So let's also take a look at the findings or the individual assets in our environment that are currently being, or that are currently vulnerable to this vulnerability. You'll notice we have 5 of them. Thankfully, it looks like 2 of them have already been remediated, but there are still 3 that need work. You'll notice that all of them have a higher risk score than our current vulnerability. They all have a risk score of 100, whereas our vulnerability has a risk score of 88. This risk scoring model is one of the major outcomes of prescriptive vulnerability response. This weighted risk score model is taking into account several factors to make this decision and help us decide which vulnerabilities to work first. It is, of course, taking into account the risk score of the vulnerability. It's also taking into account recorded futures risk score, which is definitely bumping it up. It's looking at whether there is an exploit and an active exploit, but it's also looking at the configuration items and whether these particular devices have a critical value to the business, which is something that's set in the CMDB. These together have determined that this risk score is in fact 100. Now there's a fairly big difference between something that's 100 and a high 80 in how quickly we're going to work these. And so that risk score rule that we've created is telling us which ones we need to work first and that these need attention right now. Now let's go in and look at one of these individual findings and let's see what else is happening on these. So I'm going to go look at one of them, the domain controller. And we'll see that not only do we have the risk score that we just saw, we also have a remediation target date. This remediation target date is being set by another rule based on the risk score, and it's telling us when we need to get the work done by. So not only do we have a date that we have to live up to, but that date will also give us notification when we get too close, and it will also be seen on reports, something that we'll see on a dashboard later. Additionally, we have an assignment group. A team has been automatically assigned this vulnerability, this finding, based on the class of the configuration item. This particular one is using that class-based assignment. So a team is being assigned, a date is being assigned, a risk is being assigned. We have prioritization, we have assignment. Now, you'll notice one other thing here. A person has been assigned to this too. This is not happening by a rule. This individual has seen that their team has work to do. It's critical work, and they've picked it up. So let's go take a look at Pamela's perspective and see what she sees. So when we look at Pamela's perspective, we're going to get to look at one of our 2 dashboards. The Remediation Overview dashboard lets us see the remediation focused view for Pamela. And the first thing we're seeing is we're looking at all of those findings. And yes, there are quite a few findings in the system, even in my small demo environment. Now, because in most environments, we're looking at hundreds, thousands, in some cases, millions of findings, millions of devices and their vulnerabilities, it's not very practical to work those individually. We usually spend our time grouping vulnerabilities, and in PVR, we have a specific grouping model that's part of our outcomes. Now, in Pamela's case, she's already picked up a few of those groups, and we can go take a look at those. She has 4 of those groups already open and 1 that's already under development, or sorry, under investigation. Let's go look at one of those groups and see what it looks like. This group, in fact, is the vulnerabilities we were looking at before. We can see that domain controller we were just seeing there. The group has inherited the risk score, inherited the remediation target, inherited the assignment. While Pamela is working on this vulnerability group, she can see the progress that's been made and the progress that remains to work. When she finishes working all of these items, she can resolve it. Occasionally, we'll be working on a group of vulnerabilities, and we will not be able to remediate all of them, and we'll need to request an exception. We may need to defer it to a later time, or ask that risk be accepted for the organization, or simply state that there's a mitigating control in place already. And when we do that, we have an approval model that's part of PVR, supporting either a single group approval or a double group approval, a two-step group approval that can either be run in parallel or serial. So finally, for the demo, I'd like to show one more thing. I'd like to show the overview dashboard that is meant for everybody in security to see, so that everybody's working from the same model, or that the entire organization can see. It's very important that everybody sees not just where we are today with vulnerability response, but where we have been. This dashboard shows us the state of vulnerabilities, how our findings are looking, so how those vulnerabilities are impacting our environment, and how our groups are going. So as we group those together and work those, what are the progress is on those groups? A good breakdown of criticals versus everything else in the organization. Are we making progress on criticals, or are we just working the lower priority vulnerabilities? A very important value, the mean time to remediate. Are we getting them done quickly? And of course, are we getting the critical vulnerabilities done by their due date? And then one of the most valuable pieces of information for many organizations is, are individual teams getting their work done? In this particular case, we see an example that our Windows support team, our desktop team, is doing a very good job, probably because they have a proactive patch process in place that's catching those vulnerabilities, getting most of them out of the way, and they're just catching the outlier separately. And yes, PVR and vulnerability response will absolutely reflect that in the system. But the server team is having a hard time. They made some good progress and then they leveled off. Maybe they could use some additional support. So with that, I would like to take a little bit of time and also talk about the process for us implementing vulnerability response. So just like our prescriptive vulnerability response has predefined outcomes for the experience itself, we also have a predefined implementation process. Especially at the beginning of the implementation, we have a predefined set of prerequisites we provide to have a very efficient implementation for vulnerability response. We provide prerequisites around the roles, around the technology that's required to implement it, the integration with your existing technology, and most importantly, around the training to get you up to speed to be ready to implement as well as use the system. And that training includes training credits. Through the plan, execute, deliver, and deliver stages, we go through the outcomes that you saw here in the order that you saw them here. Close is not just us wrapping up the engagement and leaving. We have hypercare support built in to the PVR project so that we make sure everything is fully functional before we leave. And we track KPIs to make sure that we have hit all the success marks. Now, for many customers, this approach is the complete vulnerability response package. For those who require additional vulnerability data, automation, or customization, PVR creates a solid framework and first level maturity ready for enhancement and a second phase. I wanted to thank you for attending our demo of PVR. We hope the years of experience we've put into vulnerability response will help your organization quickly mature your vulnerability management practice.